Hello everybody and welcome. In this video we're going to talk about Punctuate by Newfangled Audio, of course. Punctuate is a transient shaper or a transient designer of sorts. It handles transients in your tracks, but obviously the way it does it is through the mel scale and that subdivision we already talked about in some other episodes of the frequency spectrum. So your spectrum can be subdivided in bands from 1 to 26 bands, which is the equivalent of the 26 areas that scientists, we talked about it, in the 30s found out that the human hearing is the most sensitive to understand different tones for, right? So if you have 26 bands and you have 26 tones centered on those areas, and their crossovers, you're probably gonna hear all 26 sounds. But if you have a 27th sound in between some of these bands, you will have a hard time distinguishing it, just because for some reason, if two sounds don't have the necessary spacing in frequency between them, our ears perceive it as a one sound together, right? Some kind of a mixed sound. Then when they get far enough, we can perceive there are two of them. So this mel scale is the way that most of Newfangled Audio's plugins, if not all of them, deconstruct sound, and then they process it through the different parameters that the plugins offer, and then they build it up again. And so this is why they're so specific, so natural somehow, so clean, transparent, right? But also kind of not dull, not boring, very musical somehow. Very hard to describe, I already said that, which is to me a compliment towards these plugins. So what we're going to try and do here, obviously, is to put them, all the plugins to a test. But before, we're going to take a look at the interface. On top, we have presets. Then we have load, save, compare, info, settings, which is the usual visualizations and rendering with OpenGL or not. And then there's the skins, Newfangled, Modern, and Twin Turbo. Already said it many times, I like Modern, I don't touch it. Then we have the logo, and we have active or bypass. And we have a mix knob here, so we can actually inject the signal from the plugin through the dry, right? And do some sort of parallel transient shaping. Very useful, very kind of in phase and musical, so it's not creating any issues with polarity and that stuff. Input and output values for the gain with their meters, left and right. There's no auto compensation for this, so it only allows us to fine-tune the output gain by hand. Then there's the visualizer, which is stack waveforms. All of the bands are then summed up together in terms of visualization, and they are just popping up as one line. Useful to kind of get an idea of our track through the plugin, where the transients are, where the plugin is detecting the sounds, right? Or spread waveforms, which will create as many lines as the bands you're using. So if it's 26 bands, it's 26 tiny lines that will give us what looks to be a complicated way of visualizing stuff. It's actually really nice because it looks like a sandy surface to me. And you can spot, the differences in the spectrum of how transients get handled from low frequencies, obviously, to high frequencies. On the bottom, the parameter pages. So there's two main tabs, filter bank and transient. Filter bank is the area in which you decide how many auditory filter banks you want to use. If you want to use the mel scale with different crossovers based on it, however, or a custom scale which allows you to fine-tune the crossover points. You can do both. You can solo these bands, you can create new ones up to the 26 with the minus and plus. And again, you can select the crossovers. When you switch one around or you drag it around, it will switch to custom. Unless, you go back to the value that it was on, and then it will become mel again. If you want to reset it, just click on mel, and that will be the standard way. This is how the sound gets deconstructed, and transient, that tab is how the plugin will process this deconstruction. So we have transient emphasis, which will tell the plugin whether or not we want to suppress the sound or emphasize it, right? So do we want to go towards an emphasis or a suppression, which could be thought as of, I would say, more attack or more sustain, just because you're handling the transient, the attack part, but if you're suppressing it and you're re-injecting it into the dry signal, it will feel like you're pillowing up. Sometimes I use this term. You're adding sustain to the sound, right? To the program material you're using it on. Then there's adaptive transient, which goes from 0 to 100, all the way from single band to multi-band. So when a transient is detected to be prominent in one of the bands, the question is, do we want just that band to be worked on and reconstructed, or do we want to create some sort of domino effect around the bands that are influencing this transient? The result is a little bit less analytical if you go multi-band, but it's also a little bit less controlled, so it changes the sound. The transient length is how much of a workspace this plugin is going to have. We can go from super short to super long, and it's quite nice because we're going to see that if you have a transient length that is short, you will probably consciously avoid the kick parts, for example, in a drum track, because you don't have a transient length, lengthy enough, extended enough to allow the whole kick drum to be, for example, emphasized or suppressed. And so this can create a lot of versatile ways of handling your transients. Despite the 26 bands and all the frequency spectrum analysis and stuff, it's still a nice way to capture and work on specific parts of your track, not based on frequency spectrum, but on the time domain, which is really nice. Then we have adaptive length, which is longer treble or longer bass. And this is usually the last fader that I touch. It just offsets the way the length is handled in a way that to me, it's more of a perception thing. You perceive it as more bass or more treble because the adaptive length just molds itself around longer, lower frequencies that take more time, like slower, strong transients, if you want, or faster, sharper, higher frequency transients. So that's a very nice thing. We always, as usual, we can draw curves, we can reset the transients, and we go, we can remove completely the transient emphasis per band if we want it to work on a more coherent way. It will still be different bands, but it will not have the different emphasis in decibels. And here, as you can see, there's the solo again, crossover, so that reference part is the same. The thing with this plugin is that, in my opinion, the startup preset isn't quite what I would expect, and it's very kind of a showcase for this plugin, but it's usually overwhelming. So what I would like to do is I would like to start just from the get-go to design a starter preset, like a very simple one, and then maybe one that is more elaborate, but that will help us understand what's going on, and then it will help us construct or build up from that, because it can get quite complicated, and the startup preset is quite intimidating. We've been talking about it sometimes, and we say like, well, it opens up and it does a lot, and you really get a lot of information, and you have maybe too much. So let's do this, and then we'll put it to the test. Okay, so the first thing I would do is filter bank, and I would pick one band. This is really, really weird. Output and input at 0. The spread waveforms or stack waveforms at this point does not make a difference because we have one waveform, one band that gets stacked on one. So it's actually the same, but I'm going to keep it on spread. Mix 100%, active. So we have everything we need here, only one band, and then transient. What I will do is I will keep the transient emphasis per band on, although it makes little sense because we have one band, so there's no per band action. And I will keep these at, I would say, 6 decibels. The reason for it is that this amount gets emphasized or suppressed up to a maximum of 100% through this sort of like gauge value, which is the emphasis, the transient emphasis. So I will keep that at 0, the emphasized or suppressed, and I will keep the transient length at usually from 16 to 30. I will do 30 milliseconds. We're just going to try it on drums and see if we like it. I don't like draw curve for this specific instance, so I will not do it. And the adaptive transient, probably at 50%, and adaptive length, 0%. Why not? I usually fiddle with that at the very last second. So I'm going to save, and we're going to hear it on the drums, which is where this plugin has been instantiated. I'm gonna play this drum track and we're gonna hear that probably nothing's gonna be in effect because we have the emphasis set at 0. So it doesn't matter how much we fiddle with the other parameters because the emphasis is at 0%, we get nothing, no suppression, no emphasis. Then we'll go through the emphasis stage up to 100% and you'll hear that this is more of old school transient designer. And this is quite a starting point, right? Maybe too simple for this plugin. You have maybe other transient designers, but very educational nonetheless. So I'm gonna press play and we're gonna, mess with this plugin. So it's already a lot, and it does what it says on the label, right? It emphasizes and suppresses the transient. It doesn't quite extend the transient as a sustain knob on some of the most classic so-called transient designers, but it really sort of more scientifically handles the transient part, which is what, again, says on the label, right? Now, I'm gonna change the transient length and I want to find out if this one band emphasis, I'm going to set it at 50%, is actually changing in sound. It should. So let's see how. So you see what's going on, right? We have a bigger length, we have more chunks of sound of the transient that we can take and push, in this case, emphasize. And so it sounds like we're getting more transient. This is crucial, I think, because in mastering situations, you might want to have something as short as a couple milliseconds just to push maybe even 1 decibel or less. You set the emphasis at 100%, you set your emphasis per band to a maximum of 1 dB, for example, or you set it with a draw curve and then you go with the emphasis at maybe 10%, 5%. And it's just gonna sparkle some life in things. It's great for drum machines, great for a lot of stuff. I'm gonna work now with the adaptive transient and with the adaptive length so we get an idea of them. As we would expect, the adaptive transient doesn't do much because we have one band, and so single or multi-band means nothing. What about the adaptive length? In this case, it's not doing that much, so we're gonna switch to a more complicated preset, and then we're gonna try that as well. So adaptive transient, no reason to use it with one band. Adaptive length, kind of not really shifting the length because it's band-based, right? But nonetheless, this is a great startup preset. It's just a very simple transient designer that works in a clean way and it's effective. Now, I like 5 bands, so why not? Let's try this and let's try and sort of manage this drum machine track with our 50% here, with our adaptive length at 0, which we could also, disable and keep at whatever value for an easy A/B. Then we're gonna reshape this. Now the startup preset has +12 on all of them, just to allow you to go emphasis 100% and feel it, just move the emphasis and be kind of a quick start. But I kind of like to maybe keep it 100% and handle the different bands. So if you want to do it the other way around, you keep emphasis at 100 and you move these sliders here to 0. This would be a very nice startup preset. Even if the emphasis is at 100%, nothing's gonna go on because we have all of the per bands at 0, right? So this allows me to find areas that I like this drum track to have kind of a bit more energy on. Let's try it. This area doesn't quite sound like it's doing anything. Let's try it again. It does. Has just a tiny little bit of a sparkle. Then how about the lows? Now, you probably did it already. Take a look at the transient meter and how the 5 bands, are represented in those 5 lines. It's kind of very indicative of what's going on in the spectrum for this plugin. So let's say I like this effect, but I find it to be a little bit excessive, too much. I lower the emphasized. Okay, but now I kind of wish that the kick was not that much involved into the processing. The reason this is happening is we have 26 milliseconds of length. So now I'm going to shorten the length. Okay, now we do a little bit of an A-B. And you hear what's going on, right? Now it's time to play with the adaptive transient and length. I like where it is. Maybe we can find a better sort of like fine-tuning with these 2 parameters. With a multi-band scenario, I think that when the low band is pushing, I can kind of hear that it's translating to asking the second band to push as well a little bit, like, a smoothened out set of values. I kind of like it more concentrated on single bands because these are all different elements. In a harmonic situation, when you have a polyphonic synth or guitar and stuff, you probably will benefit from a multi-band scenario. You don't know, so it's nice to have. Now, adaptive length. With 5 bands, it gets audible and clear on the extreme sides, but I kind of like it a little bit less. A bit more towards the treble, less towards the bass, because it's easy to get this sort of thick kick, and I kind of know where this is going, so I kind of like it this way. Now, obviously, we could go 26 bands. I will not do it here. I will actually do it on this PPG bass, on which I have a second instance of Punctuate. So this is a different thing. I was trying something out here, and we're just gonna probably reset. Do we want to hear this? Let's try it. So by itself, this PPG sound sounds like this. Right? So what if I were to increase the transient effect through Punctuate? I came up with this preset, which uses all of 26 bands, and there's 100% emphasis. I kind of drew these by my hand, and then there's adaptive transient 49, 25 milliseconds. Let's try before and after. Hear how the presence comes up, and good reason, because I bumped a lot of 3K to 11K and a little bit of 1,000. And we have 100% of emphasis, so whenever you read 3, 5 dBs, 12, that's gonna use as much as it's allowed to. A little bit less lows, and this is quite nice. So let's hear it with the drums. And what if this was bypassed and then we engage it? What difference does it make with a drum kit playing? Now, this is intense, because if you were to try and achieve this through other means, you could use EQ, you could use compression, and would it be that quick? Would it be that effective? Because the sound is, there's an integrity to it that is preserved and it sounds nice. Although I can hear some of the harmonics in the bands are kind of coming out better because of the 26 bands probably, and the fact that my hearing is more capable of distinguishing those 26 for some reason. So I want to try and find another track and start from scratch and see where these transient designing might help me on. Maybe on the suppression factor now. Let's try that. So here I have quite an interesting track to use with Punctuate. This is a Juno track with an arpeggiator and it sounds like this. Okay, so what I want to do here is use transient management to lessen the effect of that out of phase bass, which I love. Junos, they have that amazing kind of vibey bass, but I want to kind of tighten it somehow, not reduce it in terms of EQ, not compress it. I want to handle it in a way that it's more transparent, but I want to make this track, how can I say, like a bit more ready to be in a record, not just as wild as this is really a Juno being played, with all stops off. So it just sounds great. It will be a little bit wild. So how about we try and control that? So I made a sort of a startup preset, 0 adaptive length, 50% adaptive transient, 26 bands, and I drew it by hand, just trying to get, 0 dBs on everything. But because the emphasis is at 0%, it doesn't make a difference whether I'm active or in bypass, nothing will pretty much change. So we know that we need kind of a bit lengthier transient length to get the lows, which require obviously, longer phase, longer, wavelength. And we are gonna try and work on what seems to be maybe the first 4 bands would be enough for something like that. And just by drawing them, I could try and probably emphasize them with a plus and then try and go suppress. So I will feed the transient designer more of those frequencies, but then I will go to suppress. And this should help kind of do this taming. The other bands I kind of don't need, but it will probably be necessary to just lessen the effect on the higher bands. If we want, we can put them all at 0. It will probably work. So let's try this. It's clear that up to the 4th band, they're all responsible for what's happening, but the 5th band is kind of a give or take. So I'm gonna keep draw curve, and I'm gonna try and find out the transient length that feels the best. Then we're gonna go to suppression by keeping everything the same. Could work. Hear how much of a belly now we have with 63 milliseconds. Now we go to suppression. This is quite nice, right? This would be complicated to do on EQ and compression. And I've never used a transient designer for this, maybe, I had it wrong all the way around, but I gotta say that without a sophisticated frequency spectrum control, transients are transients, full spectrum, and I wouldn't want that to change. That wouldn't be where I would use a transient designer. But here, Punctuate does more than what you would imagine. At first, I was using to bump stuff up, but this is quite interesting. So let's try a before and after. Nice. It's cleaner, it's nicer, and it feels great still, right? It feels like it's Juno. We haven't completely jeopardized the original feeling of the keyboard. Sounds great. Now, I want to tweak transient, the adaptive transient and adaptive length to see if I can find a better fine-tuning. Feels a tad nicer towards longer bass and a little bit of a single band, but other than that, I mean, it's still 26 bands, so it's a little bit more dedicated, less spilling, a little bit more separation between lows and low mids, and I like it. So how about we try it with drums and the PPG bass we had. Perfect. So now that we have context, I liked what it was happening with that on, but I gotta say it felt a little bit less present in the high mids, I would say, which would be some sort of a carrying factor that I needed. I just drew it in a way that I was going negative, right, in the emphasis per band. So this play of positive and negative, sliders on the emphasis per band, coupled with the suppression to emphasis, kind of transient emphasis slider, will allow you to be super fast and kind of offset things in a way that would require you a lot of fiddling with the mouse for the different bands. I think this is key to be quick and effective on any kind of usage of this Punctuate plugin. And this concludes everything I wanted to say on it. Thank you for tuning in.